Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. We are very happy that you are joining us for this event. It's the launch of an ebook that I had the pleasure of co-editing with my two colleagues, Dominic Rona and Luis Garicano, who will be carrying most of the presentation today, and which is a product of a several months long collection of content that we curated on Vox EU. I'm going to give you a little bit of the background. This includes what CEPR has been doing. As we all, as everybody, we were of course not planning to work on war or on the Ukraine for that matter. But we found ourselves working mostly on the consequences of this war. On the one hand side, that meant doing a new product, which we called Rapid Response. In a very short term, we put together a report on how to finance the Ukraine, how to put together a Marshall Plan. That was back in March. A second rapid response report came out just this August with a similar group of authors. And again, this is a rapid response because in response to an imminent need and crisis, it is about macro policies for the Ukraine and the issue how the Ukraine should deal with the fact that they have not enough financing cash to pay on a monthly basis for the war expenditures, and have been having to finance part of it through the central bank and the inflation tax. What we are presenting today is yet another angle, and I've already mentioned this is the product not of the three of us mainly, but actually the product of the contributions of many authors when we called for a new debate. We opened essentially a new topic on the consequences of the war, commissioned columns from people we knew were working on these issues, and accepted submissions for columns on consequences of the war. In this ebook, we put together a first lessons learned, a first look at what we have collected so far along the different dimensions on the global economic consequences. There are, of course, also many social, political, and other consequences that we could have addressed, but being economists, all of us, our strength is in understanding the global economic consequences. So I will pass on the presentation of the book in a moment to Luis Garicano first, and then to Dominic. But I wanted to show you one slide, share with you one slide which speaks to the economic consequences, and it is not in the. Okay, there it is. And it is something that all of us have been worrying about, at least very much if you were sitting in Europe, where inflation and the inflation debate has really taken hold in a big way. Here you see how the ECB and the ECB staff have had to revise upwards their inflation projections in one vintage after another of forecasts, which speaks to the fact that there have been large surprises in these forecasts. And one of the questions that people are asking is this the kind of greenflation that you had been fearing? Because we will be talking, Dominic in particular, also about what are the consequences for green transition, etc. So I thought I would show you one more graph, which in my view does not get sufficient publicity. And it is about the European versus the US as gas prices. People have a tendency, and by the way, I moderated a a very fascinating debate, as always, between Larry Summers and Paul Krugman last week at the ECB Research Conference, which you are very welcome to rewatch. And the debate there is, the European inflation and its causes. Is it different from the US? And this graph here shows you, yes, it is. It is very different. In the US, gas prices and more generally energy prices have hardly increased compared to the huge negative cost shocks that Europe has faced. Now, partly this is of course also a question of how Europe has dealt with the energy crisis or not dealt with it. And that's one of the chapters in the book, for instance, asks this question about whether tariffs at the border or caps on the price at the border, at entry, not inside, would have been a better way to go about it. And I out myself, since I am one of the authors of that chapter, the answer is yes. Just one last point before I hand over. To give a comparison, I calculated here what the current peak prices of gas, crude oil, coal, etc. mean if these were carbon taxes. So for gas, the effective carbon tax, it's not a carbon tax, let's be clear, the effective price of the peak price now would be the equivalent as if we had an 860 euro per ton carbon tax. Nobody is advocating that kind of carbon tax. Just to put things into yet another perspective. And with that, I will leave the rest of the proceedings and all the questions that they will have to deal with that come up to my colleagues. Luis, it's over to you.
Hello, Beatrice. Can you see the screen? Is it all good? Sound and
yes,
everything?
All good, all good.
Thank you. So first of all, thanks for CEPR for undertaking this rapid reaction. I think it's been really, really impressive. I think economists have had to CEPR and the boss was Beatrice. The economists have had a really prominent role in this war, particularly on the sanction issue. There has been a very large public debate centered in Germany, but all over Europe, on how costly for Europe the sanctions would be and how costly for Putin they would be. And these and other related topics have basically started from articles in Vox EU or have had a big place in the Vox EU platform. So I think CEPR has done what it should be, which is being a platform for current policy-oriented economics research in the Vox EU site. And I'm really proud of how our little contribution here has also helped to provide that platform. So thanks for the CEPR. And what I'm going to do and what Dominic is going to do is just give you a taste of the collection of pieces that we are presenting to you in this book, and give you a taste for how we think economists' work has evolved and has reacted to this war. So I think there is quite a lot of interesting material that comes in this book, and I want to just illuminate some of it. So my part is going to be more on the economic and the sanctions aspects, and Dominic is going to basically later tell you about environmental and others, which are also economic, but will have broader implications, as you will see. I don't want to really start talking economics without talking about the huge human cost of the war. It's really kind of easy to get habituated to seeing on the screen every day on our televisions and our computers, one more city attacked. But there is a lot of lives behind this crazy invasion by Putin, and I think we never should forget to focus on it. I was just checking the State Department last estimates in September 4th, but to put them in the last version, and there are 5,700 Ukrainians killed and 8,200 injured. I mean, this is a very, very large number of people suffering. Some of you know, I had the opportunity when I was in the European Parliament to go to Bucha and to Kiev and to Lviv in March and April, and it's really kind of from another time. It's something that none of us thought we would see in Europe ever again. Together with this, Ukrainians are the ones who are suffering the largest cost. The first one is the looming macro crisis. I am a bit worried about how kind of lackadaisical the world is being about this. There are some revenues coming Ukrainians' way, but it's not enough. To give you a sense, the basic economic estimates of the monthly deficit are around 5 billion. 1/3 is covered by internal revenue, quite little. 1/3 is foreign help, and 1/3 is going to be monetized, and that means inflation taxes are going to be very significant. Also, as an estimate of the cost in Ukraine, private consumption really plummeted early in the war, 75%. I mean, when you lose so many millions of your citizens, as we will see later, because they become refugees, then obviously a lot of the activity goes down, plus physical destruction, plus all of this kind of fear, etc. So banking card activity showed 75% and up to 50% starting in June, when things got a little bit better in Kiev. So the first and most significant thing I want to emphasize is human capital, and our authors emphasizes human capital. It's easy to think of physical destruction, and the book on the reconstruction that also Beatrice coordinated and CEPR produced really emphasizes physical destruction quite a bit and reconstruction of physical infrastructure. But I mean, what we know is that the human capital damage is likely to be the most significant. As all economists know, human capital investments are some of the longest lasting investments that we make in our lives, right? Much larger than housing, much longer than anything else. When a kid learns carpentry at 18 or at 16, she is likely to be a carpenter at 65. And when she goes to law school at 21, then she's likely to be a lawyer at 65. So that investment in that short period of time is essential. And when they don't go, when like in many of these tragedies that I'm going to quickly discuss, they don't go, we are likely to see very large losses and very persistent losses of human capital. The biggest, I mean, there's several of our authors talk about how much loss can we expect. The first kind of data we have is from World War II and the Vietnam War, and we see losses in mental health, clinical depression, functional limitations 60, 30, 40 years later. At 65, we can still see the traces of World War II and Vietnam War functional limitations of kids who lived in those villages many, many decades later. We also see it in Palestine with persistence, long-lasting damage. Andres, Janko, Goldberg, and Patricio and Patrinos talk about persistence as well, talking about World War II data, Tajik Civil War, Ebola crisis. They go back to Ukraine and they say, look, if you look at what Ukraine has gone through, the Ukrainian kids, which is 31 weeks of loss of schooling with COVID, and easily 18, 20 weeks, plus whatever it is because of being a refugee, changing countries, etc. We're talking, I think, at the minimum, about a year delay and potentially quite a bit more. Sasha Becker talks particularly with the cost of internal and external displacement, the 10 million refugees, and makes a huge emphasis on how important it is that those kids are going to be scholarized. And some of the policy recommendations that come out of these ideas, both by Sasha Becker and by Andres et al., have to do with making sure the neighboring countries take the refugee kids, making sure the neighboring countries adapt curriculum. And one thing that, I mean, if you followed all the COVID research and all the schooling research, there is some in Spain as well, you are aware that online tutoring and distance tutoring, as well as, of course, in-person tutoring, brings very, very positive results, that you can really do a lot by putting kind of targeted tutoring to the kids who are getting behind, in this case, the refugees. These are very cost-effective investments that the West should really help Ukraine and directly undertake. The second and the biggest debate we have all many of us have been part of it. We have been watching. We have been thinking about. We have been taking sides. Has been sanctions. Some of our authors in one of the chapters review the use of sanctions, and so is that we are seeing more and more sanctions. Here, the question hasn't been so much whether we should do sanctions, but what is their effectiveness and what kind of sanctions and what is the impact on us. So are they affecting Putin? Are they affecting us, and how much can we expect? And do we need to do more? So we have first a discussion on the ruble. Many of us worried, saying, "Look, I mean, if you look at the currency as a sign of basically the expectations of people over the long-term solvency and ability to pay debt and to not monetize debt, etc. Currency as a very basic thermometer of health, then the ruble has been doing pretty good. Actually, it's stronger than it was. Several of our authors say, look, you shouldn't worry as much. I mean, this is not a settled issue. I'm not sitting on this side of the debate. I would say I do find it worrying, but some of our very competent on this topic authors say, well, we shouldn't worry as much. What is happening is that all this export cash pile is just sitting there and they're not able to use it. So they have a lot of export revenues and they don't have import expenses. So the import sanctions seem to be working. The export sanctions, in my opinion, aren't, and we're getting on the order of 80 billion euros of fossil fuel revenues. This is from a few weeks ago, so it's probably now reaching 90 for Putin, and there is a lot of debate on how effective it is. And another chapter, Mamov and Bestova, and I'm going to argue that there's actually evidence that the banks were ready for the sanctions, and they also say that they're measurable but small effects on firms. And these kind of ambiguity on how much it's working, etc., pushes some of us and some of our authors to say, look, we need really a fossil fuel, a full embargo. We need to stop sending so much money to Putin because one way or another he's going to spend it in foreign acquisitions from China, from India, in mercenaries, and all sorts of other things. There was a kind of a central piece in the whole debate, which was the one by Bachmann and al. They wrote a paper very early on. They wrote a Vox EU column early on, and there was a gigantic argument about how big the cost to us will be. If we do this, if we do a fossil fuel embargo, how much will it cost? Do you remember Minister Habeck talking about gigantic costs, mass poverty in Germany? Most economists who looked carefully at it and who were not affiliated with lobbies, etc., have argued for an order of magnitude which is lower than COVID, significant, but significantly lower than COVID, up to 3% of GDP in the famous Bachmann et al. Piece. There is something short of fuel embargo, and that's to use tariffs or price caps. The idea is, look, at least we're going to limit the revenue that Putin is getting if we're going to continue getting some of this energy. Berdemaro and Philippe Martin have this paper in which they actually argue, this piece in which they argue, look, the right way to do this is to combine both tariffs and price caps. Price caps on gas and tariffs on oil is the best combination that is going to actually limit revenue and produce the lower damage on us. This debate is, as you know, still ongoing, but I invite you to read this and the other pieces on sanctions. This next big issue that we discuss is the trade issue. The supply chain impact has been large in a big part because it comes after COVID, when there was a big supply shock already. In big part because, as Winkler and Wood argue, the positional check of Russia in supply chains is the one that is most likely to lead to a lot of disruption, because Russia is actually very, very high in the global supply chains. It's actually exporting raw materials, both in chemicals, in energy, metals, and all of this is basically disrupting the entire supply chain below. But our authors tend to think that if policymakers don't overreact, this will be short-term impact that we can deal with. They argue that it's the misguided reactions by governments that induce autarky that really break down commerce and that lead to big losses in the past, and that if we don't compound the world-related losses by shifting these trade patterns, then it's going to be all right. Now, on the other hand, the evidence does show that when violence persists, when things last sufficiently, then people start to really switch their decisions and start to be able to the supply chains, which are initially very robust and don't move around, become much more volatile. People really start shifting, and the relocation effects, once they happen, for the same reason that they take time to happen, once they happen, they are quite persistent. If a supplier-buyer relationship is broken, then it's likely to remain once peace is established. And that means that we need to help Ukraine in particular with all those markets, and we need to kind of issues such as the single market or the entry into European Common Economic Area will be particularly important. Now, I yield the floor to Dominic, who's going to tell you about the global impact and the green energy transition. Dominic, do you prefer me that I keep passing the slides, right?
Yes, that would be fantastic. So,
okay.
So yeah. Okay, so thanks a lot to Beatrice and Luis, and to all the authors of the chapters and all the CEPR team. So now, well, the next, the book is organized in a way that first we talk about sanctions and supply chains, and then we talk about the impact of the war globally, first on developing countries and then on Ukraine. And so the chapters 21 to 24 of the book are about the impact of the war on developing countries. And there we see a very worrying impact as well, in fact, because what happens is that the food prices go up of staple food. And so various of these chapters, what they do is they create quantitative estimates of who is hit hardest, and then they would argue of what could be the impact of this. So what you see is that if you look back at the work on conflict that has been done, for example, by Burke and McGurk in a recent JP paper. Well, what you see is that actually the food price shocks have a heterogeneous effect depending on which side of the shock you are. If you're a producer, then food price shocks may for you be kind of good news. Your productivity goes up, your salaries go up, and working will become kind of attractive. The opportunity cost of leaving work will go up. However, if you're mostly food consumers and you're not producing yourself food, but you are a consumer, importer of staple food, then you may be hit very hard, and there are various mechanisms through which this can lead to more conflict. For example, there could be food riots linked to grievances, demands against the government, etc. Fighting for policy changes with respect to food. And so yeah, we expect actually in some of the countries that are big staple food importers, we expect actually quite worrying risks of higher risk of conflict as well. So the conflict may spread to North Africa, for example. Think of Egypt. And so several of the papers, they look at these questions, not just conflict, but also in terms of real incomes. So And they find, depending on the estimations, that real incomes in some countries on average may go down by between 1% and 5%. So a big effect. Slide, please, Luis. Yes. And then, well, we look at Ukraine as well. Of course, which are, we should never forget that the ones suffering most are, of course, the Ukrainian population. I may skip this slide because Luis has, covered it in much detail. So let's just move to the next slide, maybe. Chapters 29 to 31 are then the next section of the book, when we talk about multilateralism and the international system. So Kai Gehring, for example, he wrote a chapter based on his recent work on the impact on European identity, and he looked at the 2014 annexation of Crimea, looking at carrying out a diff in diff between places who are kind of closer to Russia and feel more at risk, and places who are more to the west and further away from Russia. And what he found was a very significant and substantial increase in European identity in places who were close to Russia after 2014. And so you could, and what you've seen in Europe was indeed that the reaction was quite unified, and in terms of European identity, you would see kind of such an effect. Other chapters have looked at financial integration, reaching the conclusion that well, the dollar will still be the biggest currency in our system, but that maybe we will see some deglobalization in terms of financial integration, and financial integrations will shrink to some extent. And then there was also a chapter that looked at quantifying what would happen if there was deglobalization in trade. If now before the war, we had quite integrated world trade, and now imagine that there were two blocks. There was a block of Western countries trading among themselves, and then there would be a block of Russia and their allies trading among themselves. Well, they quantified effects of what that would be, and they on average, there would be a GDP loss worldwide of 4%, and the Eastern Bloc would be hit harder. So that's kind of what they find. So let me now talk about the last chapter, which is a joint work of Beatrice, Luis, and I, where we kind of formulate 10 policy recommendations. And I mean, so of course it's a huge tragedy, this war, and the biggest concern is of course the fatalities and the situation of the Ukrainian population. But in some sense, we are kind of we would like to do more. We would want to see, well, at our limited scale of academics and of economists, what can we actually do? We're not the ones sitting in these negotiations on ceasefires, and so what can we do concretely to help in the short run, but also in the long run? And so in order to escape this feeling of being useless and being kind of just that we don't have the power to change anything really, and so what we came up with is that, well, what we can do at our scale in some sense is to think about the green energy transition. And of course, I mean, other things we can do are these rapid response papers. Beatrice talked about them. So that's another concrete thing that we can do. So we focused on 10 policy recommendations with respect to the green energy transition. Well, first of all, what's kind of important is that we should not start kind of subsidizing fuel and stuff. And many countries are doing that. So where basically, while, as Beatrice was pointing out well, while we may want to have cap prices to what is paid to Moscow, to the Kremlin, for imports of energy, while there we may want cap prices. What we don't want is a situation where basically the price going to Russia is very high and the price of local consumers in our countries is very low, and the wedge between the two is paid by taxpayers. Because what would happen is that this kind of gets the price signal wrong and gives zero incentives for people to save energy. And there have been several studies showing that with relatively reasonable efforts, energy can be saved. I mean, you know, some studies would talk about 15 to 30% of energy waste that can be kind of tackled quite easily. And we also refer to this literature in our piece. So it's better to kind of let the final consumer pay the market price. And what you want to do is, rather than subsidize artificially energy, is to kind of, give targeted transfers to poorer households who suffer most. And the money they receive as transfers, they can then either spend for energy or for something else. And in that sense, we can still, help poorer households who suffer from the price shock, but we can still kind of have the price signal, meaning that we should save energy, right? Second recommendation is that there are after the war, in the medium run, what we want to have is we want to kind of keep energy prices high, in the sense that we want this signal that people start, isolating their envelopes of the houses, putting solar panels, putting heating temperature lower, not letting the lights on all day. These energy saving measures. We want to promote that. We want to get the incentives right. But of course, taxes are very unpopular. So in Switzerland, there was a popular vote on a CO2 tax that was lost narrowly. And if you think of France with the yellow vests, there's a huge popular backlash against taxes. So what we should do is not to have taxes, but rather some bonus malus thing, where basically the ones who save energy get money back, and the ones who spoil and waste energy would have to pay into the pot. But the money doesn't go to the state. It's redistributed fully to the population. In that sense, people understand that if they pay attention, they may actually, for them, they may not pay taxes, but they may get net money back. Third, subsidizing renovation envelope isolation. There are huge differences in Europe, where basically the loss of energy due to bad isolation in the UK, for example, the worst country in a study that we quote, would be several times higher than in Norway, which is kind of the poster child of this study. And you could save so much energy just by better isolation. Fourth, install. We kind of have realized that chatting around the world is maybe not the best use of our time. It destroys the environment, and we spend less time with our beloved ones, and it's super inefficient very often. So we should kind of build up on what we've learned from COVID and do many things on Zoom, like our meeting today. So think about this in maybe having a working group to think about that, also, together with business, politics, etc. 5, stop subsidizing planes. So planes, they escape taxation. So kerosene is kind of is pretty much not taxed. So that's a very unfair advantage. And that's why you can fly to Prague from London for a very cheap fare, and by train it would be much more expensive. But it's kind of artificial. We get the prices wrong because we kind of subsidize planes because it's the only thing that's not taxed. And basically we should invest massively in trains and and taxing kerosene like other fuels. I see that Luis thinks I should be quicker, so let's move to point 6. Reduce the relative cost of electric cars with respect to fossil fuel ones. So again, have higher taxes on fossil fuel and subsidize electric cars. Also information provision. So there are some behavioral papers showing that getting information right would help people making the right decisions. 8.8 is now when we look at the supply, so that was kind of demand measures. Now let's go to supply. And for supply, some countries, quite shockingly, like Germany, that they now start kind of using gas for electricity production. And that's kind of the most polluting way to produce energy, of course. And so if this is done because we're so desperate and we have to do it in some cases, then it's important that it's done in an explicitly temporary way and that it's conditional on eliminating obstacles to wind and solar, and that we kind of make sure that okay, it's bad policy in the short run, but we are desperate, but we kind of want to have a full commitment that in the long run, these losses for the environment are more than compensated. 9, extend plant lifetimes when safely possible for nuclear plants. So there we had within the team quite a debate between Luis and me, but we can talk more about that. But the idea is that, well, at least as far as I'm concerned, you know, in the long run, I would not want to build on nuclear, and so you know, I agree with the plan of getting out of nuclear. But it's true that at the moment we're in so big trouble, and we have even to go back to burning gas to create electricity, that maybe we want to be, you know, a bit less fast than we were at the beginning in our plans. So maybe we should kind of, in the short run, extend nuclear plants if it's possible safely to get through the current crisis. 10, we want European united response with respect to, you know, purchase of gas, storage of gas, and then fiscal solidarity mechanisms for those hit hardest. So it's kind of, I mean, you know, green energy transition is kind of riddled with externalities and spillovers, and so which means that we kind of need to work together, you know, as a continent, not just the EU but whole of Europe, to kind of make sure that that we can get the best outcomes possible. Okay, so let's stop here from my side, and let's maybe open up to questions, I guess.
No intentions from me, Dominic. I just didn't want to have you have to ask. So, that's good. So, any questions? Anybody wants any further thought or add anything or any comments? Okay, so I think we're done.
So there is.
What was your discussion about nuclear energy? Yes, I can start on that one because Dominic more or less told his position, so I tell mine. Marcello Piemonte debate. So the issue here was how do we phrase this nuclear the need for nuclear, and the difference was about the long term. We basically agreed, as Dominic said, that nuclear has to be part of the solution this year. The question is, do we think that nuclear has to be part of the solution, at least in the whole, let's say, transition to the 55 kind of zero carbon world? My view is that in terms of mortality and in terms of other risks, nuclear is the safest energy, much safer, thousands of times, tens of thousands of times safer than coal in terms of deaths per megawatt hour produced, and safer than all the other energies. That we do have a problem with storage, but we know how to solve it. The Finnish already have built a deep storage for nuclear. And that, I mean, my view, okay, so this is not a book. My view is that we made the biggest possible policy mistake ever in the 70s when we stopped nuclear. So if the nuclear plants had proceeded as we thought, global warming wouldn't even have been in the agenda, it wouldn't have existed. My view is that nuclear is carbon-free, and that at some point we were putting too much emphasis on certain things, such as indeed those very low probability accidents with indeed very low number of deaths, even in the worst cases, per megawatt hour produced, and not enough weight on the danger, on the peril to our planet from substituting nuclear, but by what we have done, which is gas, coal, etc. So my personal view, which is not the view of the three of us, and definitely not Dominic's view, is we should reconsider that policy. Where we agree is on immediate closings of plants in Germany, Spain, Belgium, etc., where all of us agree that it should be in the short run reconsidered. So it's a short run, long run issue. Dominic, did I describe it reasonably well?
Yeah, no, and I mean, it was like in a very civilized economist style, we were then kind of exchanging emails to discuss which wording, etc. But we rapidly found a good compromise. So exactly, yeah. So Luis is more pro-nuclear than I am, but globally, at least for the short run, I think we're all three of us have kind of the same view for the short run. For the long run, not exactly, but that's okay.
So we have this changing green agreement conditions likewise to accept nuclear energy as green. So in Europe, there is, as you know, a taxonomy, which is an effort to describe energies as green and brown in order to energies in every activity as green and brown in order to be able to characterize loans to them and to allow investors who want to take this criteria into account to take it. And indeed, the compromise, the German kind of French compromise, the Germans wanted the gas in the transition, the French wanted nuclear. So the compromise in Europe at the moment is we will have gas being allowed as an energy transition to be considered green until the 30s, 2035, and nuclear until the 40s, but with a big limitation on the type of nuclear and type of gas. So basically, gas has to be only when it's replacing worse energies and when the plants are particularly clean, much cleaner than now, and nuclear under the conditions of durability, etc., and of usage that I was describing, the limit on the 40s. So that's a compromise. Yes, I think that compromise, the war and the energy crisis, which, remember, Putin started cutting us gas in the fall of 21, summer of 21, in order to be sure that we didn't have a lot of gas when he actually used it as a weapon. So that energy crisis, I think, has played a role in pushing Europe to be more flexible with those two energies. I mean, do you want to take the third?
Yeah, no. I mean, I have nothing to add to this answer. I think very, very, very clear. There is another question, Luis, on whether we think whether we're going to go back to full trade and trade in fossil fuels, etc. Maybe I'll let you answer.
Yeah, I'm happy to take the first step. I think nothing will be the same. I think the legacy of Merkel has been forever tainted by putting trade in front of everything else. The Ukrainians complained that they said, well, in 2014, we already had an aggression. The Georgians had an aggression before, etc. And Europe didn't do anything. And it's true that we have been our hands tied because of those trade links. I think that this dramatically changes our consideration of how much we can depend on China, which is the next big issue. And I think that many of us, I was the most free trader that you could find, realize that we need to have these security aspects very much in mind in the future.
I guess one thing I'd like to add is, so I also think that things may change. So Richard Baldwin, by the way, has several kind of interesting Vox pieces where he talks about global trade as a outlook. I guess for my vision on the energy is that we should kind of, this literature on energy, natural resources and conflict, to which I've also contributed a bit. What it shows is that basically petrostates are terrible in 100,000 ways. So it correlates with civil wars, interstate wars, corruption, mismanagement, authoritarianism. So kind of having fossil fuels is like a terrible thing, and we should get rid of it. And we want to make sure that we get rid of it in a smart way, so that the next curse is not just mining, but that we kind of do it in a smarter way. And the way I see it is that what we should do is we should decentralize energy provision. So if everybody has some solar panel on the roof, and you have wind and you have water and you have kind of very decentralized, localized energy provision, the advantage of this is that you don't have, it's kind of power is diffused and it's not in the hands of one person. And the one thing I like about my country, Switzerland, is that nobody really has power. Not even in the government, you have 7 ministers with the same amount of power. And for the really important things, there's a popular vote, and you have 8 million Swiss people. You have the ones who are old enough to vote, etc., who decide. So power is very diffused, and I think for energy we should do exactly the same thing. If you don't have a huge oil field that gives you several billions a year, and then the rebels want to grab the oil, and the autocrat wants to keep in power to have a grip on the oil, well then basically that's dangerous. While if you have decentralized energy provision, then that's less dangerous, and it's of course much better for the environment. So that's why I think it's last second to do this green energy transition, and already through that the trade patterns will change. Yeah,
that's it. Totally agree with that. Would you like to stay online at the end? Okay, so thanks very much. We will close the event here. I don't think I have anything more to say. Maybe Beatrice wants to take over. Thank you all, or maybe we, Dominic and me, just do it. I don't see her right now there. So thanks very much from CEPR and from
thanks a lot.
Very much from us for being here, and we hope you enjoy the book. Dominic, you also. Yeah. Oh, she's there.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah, thanks a lot for everything to everybody who has contributed to the book, and we hope you enjoy it, and thanks a lot for coming.
Bye. Okay. Okay. Yes.